My name is Javier Hernandez and my nickname is Chicharito.
SuperO C9Z590-CGW. SuperO is Supermicro's gaming brand. Z590 is obviously Intel's Rocket Lake chipset, and the W end means it has Wi-Fi. In the package you get an actual paper instruction booklet, a few accessories, I/O panel, SATA cables, Wi-Fi antennae, front panel connection thing, and some fasteners for M.2s. And then you come to the motherboard itself, which is smart, understated for sure, 3 M.2 shields, a hefty metal heatsink on the chipset, and relatively understated heatsinks on the VRMs. You can actually see the VRMs just with your naked eye. 6 phases on the CPU. 6! Admittedly they're Infineon 90 amp, but that's not very much. We've seen up 14, maybe even 16 amp on some other boards. I'm thinking Gigabyte in particular. So by the standards of Z590, this board looks like it's playing down a bit. And yet the price here in the UK, we're told, £419 including VAT. That's a lot. That's taking the SuperO C9Z590-CGW right up against the big boys. There's no room for hiding when you're looking at that kind of price point. Pull off the heat shields, it looks smart enough. It looks solidly built as well. In terms of features, it's got most of what you'd expect to see, but bizarrely, no RGB headers, neither the old school 12 volt nor the new addressable RGB. That, to say the least, surprises me. The front panel connections are laid down. That doohickey there is for connecting, and then you can connect your case to it. I don't have an issue with that one way or the other. I don't think it's a brilliant idea. Neither am I shouting for it on other motherboards. Taking a tour around the board. Up here we have micro buttons for power and reset. Take a closer look and you'll see we have 2 long expansion slots at the top and 2 x1s, and then we have the 3 M.2s. The Aquantia 10 gigabit chip and its heatsink are between the 2 long expansion slots. If I put a graphics card in place, you will see it overshadows the second expansion, so you are using either that slot or that slot. Both slots are most unlikely to be available at any one time, and your graphics card is likely to overshadow the 10 gigabit. On the rear I/O we have a DisplayPort 1.4a and an HDMI 2.0b. We have 4 old school USB 2s. We have 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A's. We have 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 x2s, they're Type C's. There is no Thunderbolt. Above those you will see a couple of Ethernets. One is Intel Gigabit, the other is 10 gigabit Marvel Aquantia. Wi-Fi is Intel AX201, but that's Wi-Fi 6, not 6E, and then we have surround sound audio. So the features are okay, but they're nothing particularly special. The test system I'm using consists of an Intel Core i9-11900K. I've got some G.Skill Trident Z Neo RAM rather than my usual Corsair Vengeance LPX because the BIOS wasn't behaving nicely with XMP on the Corsair. 3600 MHz memory, as you see, actually running at 3467. Graphics card is a Sapphire RX 6800. SSD is a Sabrent Rocket 4.0. Power supply is a Seasonic Prime Platinum 1300 watt. This cooler is the MSI MPG Core Liquid K360 that I've used in my Z590 Rocket Lake testing. Very effective cooler, Acetec 7th Gen with 3 120mm fans. However, it has no RGB because the motherboard doesn't support RGB. Before we go any further, I'm going to show you around the BIOS of the C9Z590 so you can see how SuperO Supermicro handles the Z590 chipset and the Core i9 Rocket Lake processor, because seeing is believing and a picture tells 1,000 tales. Let's start with optimized defaults. Okay, so we'll navigate around using the keyboard. I go left from advanced to overclocking. I've now got 2 highlighted tabs. Enter to go to overclocking. Haven't seen that before in a BIOS. Okay, BIOS 1.0, which is the latest BIOS. They haven't done the updates. which is actually slightly concerning, and it shows this is quite frankly a work in progress. Overclocking. Go down across to advanced, go down to CPU cooler tuning, and we've seen a similar feature with MSI, so you can pick a power profile based on the type of cooler. This is a good move. This is quite retail-y. So box cooler, you can see 65 watts, get a boost and back to 65. Tower air cooler, your proper job, boosts to 177, pulls back to 125. Water cooler, so all in one, 250 watts, pulls back to 125, or you can go manual. Let us go with water cooler, but it's highlighted. Let's take it that that's been applied. Overclocking. Oh, we're now up at the top summary. Go down. Overclocking. Memory profile. XMP. And look, the DDR4 3600, 3467. Again, BIOS 1.0. This is frankly a work in progress. Save and exit. HWinfo64 tells us that the PL1 is indeed 125 watts and the PL2 is 250 watts, exactly as the CPU cooler part of the BIOS told us it would be. Let's just run Blender and see what that means. Putting 217 to 18 watts for the processor, running at 4.7 gigahertz. Consistent 4.7, power to 16 watts. Which obviously is nowhere near 250. CPU package has now pulled back to 125 watts because the boost has finished. And we're now at 4.1 gigahertz all cores. 4.0, it's going to fluctuate between 4.1 and 4.0. There we have it, 125 watts. Clock speed is absolutely on the floor, and that's what you get for running a Core i9 on a Z590 SuperO motherboard. Back in the BIOS, now we have the option of going to manual cooler setting, which is this fella here. So now we can choose our power limits by changing these figures here. But let's go back to water cooler where we were before and come out of that section, go to overclocking. Oh, hang on, the focus has been grabbed up here for some reason. Let's go to overclocking and we go down to advanced CPU OC setting. Within config TDP configurations, we can manually set the power limits. So currently showing as 125 and 250. If we want to punch in manual limits there and indeed the time, we will see, we do get a note, yes. So power limit 2 value in milliwatts. BIOS will round to the nearest 1/8 of a watt. 0 is no custom. 12.5 watts you enter 12500. So to put power limit of 250 in manually, 250,000 and 250,000. Why is a total mystery to me. So we now have PL1, PL2 set to 250. Use the drop down, put the window to max. And we save. And back in Windows. And we run Blender once more. 4.7 gigahertz on the processor. Power for the package 216 watts, which is where it was previously, but now that should be sustained. You will note it is nowhere near the 250, which is the power limit setting. We're way below that. And indeed the clock speed is maintained at 4.7. Power is maintained at 218 watts, so nowhere near the 250, but considerably higher than 125. No doubt you're wondering why I didn't simply enable Intel Adaptive Boost in the BIOS and let the processor run at full speed. Simple answer, this BIOS does not support that feature. It is version 1.0. I'm told that future BIOSes will indeed be updated to support Adaptive Boost. Right now, this Z590 motherboard does not support the feature that distinguishes Z590 from lesser 500 series chipsets, even with Core i9-11900K installed. One quirk I discovered in my testing is that with a graphics card installed, the system disables the IGP on the Core i9-11900K. If, on the other hand, I force the IGP on in the BIOS, the system refused to display an output unless I connected the monitor cable to the rear I/O panel, i.e. to the DisplayPort or HDMI. So I didn't have the option of running a graphics card and having the IGP enabled in case I wanted to do some sort of video encoding using the IGP. It was either one or the other, not both. That's something that SuperO tells me they will also address in a BIOS update. And then you saw navigation was not perfect. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't anything like as good as Asus Gigabyte MSI. So the BIOS, there's work to be done. So let's go through the performance figures, and I'm going to warn you up front, they're not great. 3D Mark times by the CPU score, you will see that the SuperO comes fairly far down the charts. When you dive into 3D Mark Core i9-11900K figures, it is right at the bottom of the charts. But look at the clock speed, 4.2 GHz. No wonder it's down low. Moving on to Blender Classroom, you can see two power figures for the SuperO, 125 watts and 250 watts, i.e. out of the box and kind of pushed. And on 125 watts it suffers deeply, 250 watts it moves up the charts. Compared to the other Z590 boards I've tested, it's slow. Moving on to Cinebench R15 Multi, this is a very quick test and you can see the consequences the SuperO does perfectly okay. In single core, well, power isn't an issue. There we have it, the SuperO's moved up the charts. Cinebench R23 runs for a long time, over 10 minutes. The consequence is obvious. 125 watts, the SuperO suffers. 250 watts, it does perfectly alright. Cinebench R23 single core, it's up there and fighting. Not winning, but fighting. Moving on to gaming, we've got some really peculiar results. Deus Ex Mankind divided at 1440p. The SuperO does badly. I do not understand these figures. It's as though the low power and relatively low speed kicks it heavily. Far Cry 5 New Dawn is even worse. You have to consider the processor is running at a reasonable speed in 250 watt mode, and yet the frame rates are poor. And Watch Dogs Legion, again, appalling frame rates. I have no explanation for this behavior, but that's 3 games, each tested at 1440p, and the SuperO board does badly. CPU power draw, out of the box, 125 watts is way lower than the other motherboards we tested to date. 250 watts is moving towards the other boards, but 250 watts, it actually pulls to 18 watts, and we've seen significantly more juice required by other motherboards. So this, on the face of it, is a good thing. And then we have VRM temperatures out of the box, 125 watt mode, 31 degrees for the VRMs. And when the CPU is drawing to 18 watts, the VRMs are running at a mere 38 Celsius. So lower power draw from the CPU equals very low temps for the VRMs. Very strange performance figures for the SuperO motherboard. Quite clearly low power equals low clock speed equals low performance. Not what we expect to see from a Core i9 running on a Z590 motherboard. When I've reviewed SuperO motherboards in the past, I've pointed out that their adherence to Intel's power policies causes them some problems. If you feed a nominal 95 watt processor with 95 watts, it runs a lot slower than the competition using say 135 watts. However, with Rocket Lake, you're in a whole different league of weird. If you feed a processor such as the Core i9 that ordinarily uses 250 watts, maybe even 290 watts, feed it 125 watts, you're just not competitive. The bigger problem for me is that Intel Z590 has very little reason to exist unless you're using it with a Core i9 processor and Intel Adaptive Boost. This is a Z590 motherboard that does not do that job. So at the moment, it makes no sense to me. Let me go over the pros and cons I've come up with. Pros: it has dual Ethernet including Marvel Quantia 10 gigabit. Also, it has postcode debug and it has micro buttons. It also has a decent list of headers and connectors, but many motherboards, particularly at this price point, have headers and connectors such as you would barely believe. So while this board has a number of reasonable features, they're nothing special. On the cons side of things, BIOS 1.0 requires work. The XMP didn't work for me, and when you look at SuperO's list of supported memory configurations, it's utterly hopeless. So it's no great wonder that XMP at the moment is a work in progress. There are no RGB headers. I like RGB to a certain extent. RGB headers cannot cost a great deal. The idea that a £400 plus motherboard doesn't have RGB, that's just peculiar to my mind. BIOS 1.0 does not support Intel Adaptive Boost. Now, I don't like Intel Adaptive Boost. However, it is pretty much the only reason for having a Z590 chipset. If you don't have that feature on this chipset, the logic of the motherboard falls to pieces. The customer at the very least should have the option of using Adaptive Boost. These 690 amp VRMs for the CPU V-Core, they look peculiar, they look out of place. Now I have to say they perform very nicely on this board. It does after all only have the one 8-pin EPS connector. The board doesn't use a lot of power. So on the one hand the VRMs are fine, but that's because the processor isn't being given enough power to perform correctly. On the other hand, were you to start sticking heaps of power through the processor, would the VRMs be up to the job? We're kind of betwixt and between on that one. Certainly the temperatures of the 90 amp Infineon VRMs in this relatively low power state, icy cold. However, my Core i9 processor was not working hard. Overall, my takeaway here is, would I recommend the SuperO C9Z590-CGW? I would not. It's very expensive, and to my mind, there's no logical reason to buy it. And my conclusion is that when they finish it, it might turn out to be quite a nice product, but right now it's a work in progress.